Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. I am glad to be with you today here. I got an old friend that we're going to be conversing. Milton and I had a chance to travel to Zimbabwe together and visit the Great Wall and to meet Mugabe. I mean, we were there for what, Milton, about 11, 14 days, something
Right.
like that.
Yeah, almost 2 weeks, I remember.
Right. So we're going to be looking at the new scramble for Africa. This is going to be a 6-part series. And what we want to do today is to kind of look at the first scramble for Africa and why the first scramble for Africa. So, Milton, can you give us a little bit of the background of the first scramble for Africa? And if you would look at when the Moors ran out of Spain and left the west coast of Africa. Well, did they settle in the west coast of Africa? What was the results of the Moors being run out of Spain by the Europeans, the Spanish?
Well, I think if you're doing a 6-part series, for the sake of comrades that may not be familiar with some of the back history, I think we will have enough opportunity to give them a more holistic story. And I say this because recently one of my students told me that he was sitting on a train, a subway train, and he got to speaking to another young brother, and he said, where are you from? And he said he's from Jamaica. And my student told me about how he had just learned in his history class about the origin of man and womankind and Africa, and how proud he felt with that knowledge. And the young Jamaican brother was taken aback and actually offended to be told that he is from Africa. And he denied that. And my student was quite shocked that a young man from Jamaica could not relate to Africa, the origin of mankind. So I think it's very important that we go back a bit further and let people know that we all come from Africa, including Asians, including Europeans, because at the end of the day, race itself, as you and I, brother, know, is a social construct. You see? So there are a few elements that I think our young people and even the elders need to be reminded that without Africa, there's no history, because there's nobody else without Africa. And as our great teachers have taught us, the late Professor John Henry Clark, the late Cheikh Anta Diop, and our esteemed comrade, Professor Jeffries, who continues to teach this, that we trace the earliest origins of man to Africa. The human remains, the people that came before the modern forms of human beings, sapiens sapiens. Way before that, we have discoveries in South Africa, for example, the Tong child, dating back to 2.8 million years old, found in 1924 in South Africa, the Tong child. We have Zinjanthropus, dating back to 1.5 million to 2.5 million years old. These were remains found in Olduvai Gorge in what is now the modern country of Tanzania. And then we have Dinkinesh. Europeans and outsiders call it Lucy for some reason, but Ethiopians call it Dinkinesh. And it's important that we call the remains Dinkinesh because it was found in Ethiopia, and Ethiopians call it Dinkinesh. And that dates to 3.2 billion years old. And that's where man actually and woman originated, in the so-called Rift Valley, the Great Lakes region of East and Central Africa. And then from Ethiopia, they going in that Rift Valley fault line all the way to South Africa. And then the earliest civilizations, when man and woman harnessed agriculture, which was very revolutionary, as you know. Before that, people spent all day hunting and gathering food, so they could not sustain societies. But then, because of the rich Nile, the rich deposits of the soil along the River Nile. And there was no surprise that one of the earliest and most sophisticated civilizations of all time evolved around the River Nile, from what was Nubia, and then extending all the way through Kemet, which later on became much more popularly known as Egypt. And that's when Africans settled along the shores, the banks of that river. And Africans also migrated from what is today the Sahara Desert. People don't know that at one time, that was entirely green. It was green, it was lush, it was fertile soil. But then when that started becoming eroded, it started becoming desertification. That's when Africans started migrating, going toward what is now today West Africa, toward the south. But then most migrated from the west to the east to go to the shores of the River Nile. And that's where the greatest civilization evolved. Many people know it as Egypt. We, of course, know it as Kemet. And there's no debate that that was an African civilization, because the first human beings were Africans. But go ahead, brother.
No, I just want to say, because they've had so many programs lately trying to say that the what is it, out of the oh boy, I don't know, I'm having, but anyway, they're saying that other areas produce great civilizations before Egypt, and these civilizations had an impact on the development of Egypt. So I wanted you to address that, because there's a lot of videos coming out now.
Oh, that is fine. All societies, all nations interrelate and exchange with other nations. But if human beings originated from Africa, then it goes logically that the earliest civilizations were African and in Africa, because at one time we were all Africans. If the original inhabitants of Africa had not migrated to settle other parts of the world, as Cheikh Anta Diop taught, everybody would be on the African continent and everybody would be African. It was about beginning maybe 100,000 years ago that Africans left the continent through the Isthmus of Suez, when the continents were connected, and it was easy to migrate from there to what is now known as the Middle East and to Asia, and then from the western side, from the Straits of Gibraltar, to migrate to Europe. And it was over a period ranging from 20,000 to 60,000 years that through adaptation to these new environments and climatic conditions, that human beings took on different features. Had that not happened, the features would look more or less like I look or like you look. But it was because of that dispersal around the world that we took on so-called different races. But in essence, we are all African genetically. And that's now been proven by science. When Cheikh Anta Diop was trying to teach this, many people were trying to challenge him or ridicule him. But I think that today, in the 21st century, is now widely accepted. And anybody can do the research and they'll find that even publications like the New York Post are now publishing articles acknowledging that human beings originated in Africa and then spread to populate the other parts of the world. In any case, people that say civilizations also evolved in other parts of the world, there's no denying that. There's no reason to even deny that. But the question that needs to be posed is that, why were they not able to build the kind of monuments and the kind of pyramids that we see in Egypt? It was not built in Europe or Asia and then magically transported to Africa in Egypt. So that is what I always tell my students, to always keep that in mind. So yes, they populated other parts of the world. And in Africa, it's not unique in terms of development of civilizations. And I use this word hesitantly. I actually don't prefer it myself. I prefer to use culture or refined high levels of culture. And I support what our late esteemed teacher, Brother Walter Rodney, said. He says when you start using the word civilization, it starts contrasting and showing that perhaps other societies were not evolved or inferior. But you and I know what I mean when I say civilization is not to denigrate any other society or any other people. So this civilization was not unique in evolution in Africa, and it was not accidental. Egypt was one and not a one-time phenomena. Kemet. In any case, Kemet owed its ancestry to Ethiopia, to Nubia. And then in terms of development of high levels of culture and civilization in Africa, why do I say it was not accidental? Because as you pointed out, there were numerous, very sophisticated cultures and societies that evolved in Africa. Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Congo, you name it. Great Zimbabwe with Monomatapa, and then the East African coast, all those sophisticated city-states that the Portuguese were shocked when they came in the late 14th century to find these highly evolved societies engaging in trade, intra-African trade, which is so sad because when you look at it today, intra-African trade amongst and between African countries amounts to only about 14% of the trade that they engage with. And that is part of what's holding Africa back as well. Because after the colonials came and hijacked the trade pattern, they locked Africans in trade patterns that benefit the outsiders, in this particular case, the Europeans, to the detriment of Africa's whole economy. But before that intervention by the trespassers, almost all the trade was between African countries, amongst African societies. And we didn't have these countries. Yes, we had nations, but we didn't have the modern type of nation states with all these boundaries that were drawn by the Europeans. And I say all this to show you how sophisticated these societies had evolved even long before England existed. Because as you know, modern England did not exist until the 10th century. In the 10th century, Africa had known many, many kingdoms, sophisticated societies. Let's go back to Egypt for a minute. The pre-dynastic Egypt, going back to 10,000 years BC.
Yes.
And then when we come to the dynastic Egypt, when we go to 3,200 BC, and we look at Emperor Menes, Menes, and I say this for the young viewers, because young viewers always go online to do their research. And when you go online to do your research, I also suggest you look up the image of Emperor Menes, because the monuments preserve that. So you will see that there's no debate that Emperor Menes looks like me. When you see the image, you could even mistake it to be my image of Emperor Menes. So to say that Kemet was somehow developed by people who came from the outside is just nonsensical and laughable. What people sometimes forget is that through the many centuries, Egypt suffered many invasions. After it was at the peak of its power, and then it was in decline, there were many invasions. The Assyrians invaded, the Greek, the Romans, the Libyans, the Persians. So after that, you had all this intermingling. And that is why the features of what we see today in Egypt is not the original Kemet of the pre-dynastic Egypt or 3,200 years BC. And then, of course, in the 7th century, we had the Islamic invasion of Egypt. So now when you see the contemporary society of Egypt, it does not reflect really the historical Egypt that we know of, the Egypt that developed that culture and that civilization. By the time Egypt was conquered in the 7th century, all the major monuments had been built long time ago in Egypt. And that is why sometimes people are confused. And of course, then we have the modern contemporary focus of the Hollywood representation of Egypt, which of course is of the whitened, Europeanized Egypt. And then the question I always tell my students to remember is to ask, why is it that the outsiders who are sometimes credited with building the civilization and culture of Egypt, why were they not able to build similar civilizations in their own native soils before they came to Egypt? I think that is a logical question that must always be posed. So this was the early Africa, the Africa where human beings evolved, the Africa that developed all these high levels of cultures and societies. It's the Africa that Europeans first met when Europeans ventured to that part of the world in search of trade initially, and did engage in trade. And then, of course, being greedy, being more into materialism and commodities, that is when the Europeans started plundering Africa. Beginning, of course, the earliest was the Portuguese. And the Portuguese started that with the plundering that occurred on the east coast of Africa, where you had all those great city-states that had evolved, Mogadishu, Mombasa, Kilwa, all those great civilizations along the east coast of Africa. The Portuguese started attacking them, started plundering, started committing massacres. And then, of course, from then on, it was easy to see how that would evolve into the enslavement of Africans, particularly after the Pope, the Papal Bull, granted the Portuguese and then the Spaniards the authority to enslave so-called heathens, so-called people that were not Christians. So you ask the question, what kind of Christianity is this? What kind of religion is this that endorses and actually blesses the commodification of other human beings, the massacre of other human beings?
Milton?
Yes,
we
brother.
talked about Persians and others. Were they African people? The Persians, were they black? All these other civilizations, or I should say nations, that you talked about,
yes,
that had invaded Africa at one time or another, invaded Egypt at one time or another. Where
yes,
did they come from?
They were genetically African, of course, but physically, their appearance is not what we associate with Africa today. As I said, race is a social construct. So they would not be considered physically to be African. But originally, as I pointed out earlier, we were all Africans originally. But obviously, physically, they did not think of them that the same way. Certainly intellectually, they did not perceive of themselves in Africa as African. And that, of course, is the mindset that exists much more so today. It's become much more intensified today in the 21st century in terms of people are not being taught the origins of human beings. So in fact, it is widely known, and once in a while, students would read about it. People generally would read about it, but it's not taught as a critical subject in the schools. Because if it was taught, then obviously you would have to do a lot of unpacking of history. Then why is it in the first place that fellow human beings could enslave other human beings? Why is it that fellow human beings could colonize other human beings? And why is it that in the 21st century today, other human beings can maintain a neo-colonial exploitative relationship vis-a-vis the countries that are now industrialized and are wealthy, but are actually building their wealth by exploiting the countries that are not industrialized, that mostly produce agriculture and mineral resources. And most of these countries, as you know, are today confined in Africa. So race and racism, as you and I know, was created as a concept to rationalize exploitation, enslavement, colonialism, and the plunder of resources. You have to demonize the victims first, make it acceptable for them not to be treated as human beings. How else could you rationalize keeping people and chattel slavery for centuries, treating them literally like mules, like animals, or actually worse than animals in many respects? So in order to build that mindset and to make Europeans able to engage in that kind of abuse is to condition their mind to regard Africans as not human beings, as inferior and lesser to the Europeans. And that's how racism evolved, and that's how racism is still with us today. The regard and the mental conditioning, whether through literature, whether through advertisement, whether through all the kind of propaganda that is disseminated, that Europeans absorb to condition their mind, whether it's conscious or unconsciously, I don't care. Even the most open-minded European is unconsciously conditioned to believe and to be convinced that he or she is superior to non-Europeans, particularly to Africans. So it's so ironic that Africans are regarded as the bottom of the totem pole, when in fact, there would be nobody else in the world without Africans. So everything is turned upside down. But that goes through centuries of literature, centuries of propaganda. So in terms of us teaching the youth that everything is upside down, it's a great challenge, but it can be done. And that is why it's important for us to have these kind of conversations.
I wanted to look at the time the Moors were driven out of Spain, because the Moors, well, if you would talk about who were the Moors, and there is the Moors who were the Arab Moors and the African Moors. And then when they were driven out of Spain, where did those Moors go? And some of those same Moors were involved, I should say, religiously were involved in the destruction of the last great African empire, Songhai. So if you could kind of together in a way that we can understand it, and see that defeat of the Moors from Spain set up the whole defeat of the kingdom of the Songhai Empire.
Well, it was not only Songhai, and we have to go even a bit further, as the late Cheikh Anta Diop reminds us that in antiquity, at one time, what we know as Kemet controlled what is now known as the Middle East, controlled what is known as Asia. So in other words, when we see the contemporary European control of much of the world, that is a much, much later occurrence in history. And Cheikh Anta Diop thought it was important to teach this history, to know that at one time, in fact, Kemet, Africa, dominated much of the world. And that, going historically from the evolution of the first high civilizations or cultures in Africa, should not be surprising that the power would then be extended. And to use his own term, in one of the great lectures and interviews that he delivered with Listerveld, and that interview I think is also available online. That was the imperial stage of Africa, a very much earlier stage, going back to antiquity, even before the domination of Southern Europe by the Moors, who were Africans from North Africa. And as you know, North Africa became a very diverse area in terms of the diversity of what you call race. And it's a word that, as I said myself, I don't like using myself, because there was a lot of intermingling. So you have Africans that have my features, and you have Africans that have features that are mixed with the Arab invasion. And then you have Africans who call themselves the Berbers, who are now inhabit what later on became the Sahara Desert. So when Africa was still militarily more powerful than Europe, that is when the Africans from North Africa were able to invade and dominate parts of Southern Europe, including Spain, including France, and all the other regions of the southern part of Europe. And then, of course, the tide later changed. And when the defeats were incurred in Europe, that changed the reverse and the trajectory of history, so that the Europeans were then able to dominate the Sahel, what is known as the Sahel region of Africa, or the northern part of Africa. And that domination ultimately also extended toward the west coast of Africa. And there are also a number of reasons for that. In Africa, the demand for resources to sustain people were not as critical as it was in Europe. So that you find that people in Africa did not really have the necessity to develop the kind of weapons that were developed in European countries. The European countries had an incentive to develop those kind of weapons because there were weapons of conquest, like the cannons, for example, and the big guns. African countries didn't need that. They did not need to develop weapons such as cannons, which were weapons of conquest. So this put them at a disadvantage when Europeans came up with those types of weapons. And then during the invasion of Africa, Africans were not able to defend themselves from these sophisticated weapons that the Europeans had. And these weapons, by the way, by the Europeans came at a later stage. So that, for example, Africa actually could not be fully dominated until the latter part of the 19th century, the last 20 years of the 19th century. By that time, Europe had developed the most sophisticated weapons, and they were able to conquer and subdue and colonize Africa.
Okay. Let's look at Morocco, at the Moors in Morocco, because they allied with England, in that England gave them sophisticated weapons. We was talking about cannons and the rifle and other forms of sophistication in warfare that enabled from Morocco the Arabs, the Africans who had become Muslims, and the Muslims were also in Senegal. But that war, what was that war about that led to the destruction of Senegal? And the reason why I wanted to set that up is because Senegal was the last great kingdom in Africa to fall, which left the west coast of Africa kind of open for European penetration and domination via Portugal and the Europeans.
Yes, that was the empire of Songhai. And that was a war of resources, of course. It was a war to control the trade routes, the lucrative trade routes, and a war to control the gold, which was abundant in West Africa and any part of Africa that was south of what had become by that time the Sahara Desert. As you know, historically, it was a very lucrative trade called the Trans-Sahara trade, where the resources exchanged primarily were gold coming from West Africa or Southern Africa relative to the desert, and in return for the salt coming from the northern part of Africa. So it was to control that trade route, and it was also to ultimately spread the religion in other parts of West Africa that had not yet embraced Islam. And by emerging victorious in that conflict, it increased the appetite to engage in more military conquest against Africa in order to take control of the resources. In addition to the gold, of course, there was also the trade in enslaved Africans. So, of course, this kind of trade provided the incentive for Africans to engage in wars of conquest and to actually capture others. And this is one critical aspect of the history that my students always ask me. And I explain to them that historically, of course, as societies evolved, including in Africa, you could have conflicts over resources and over territory, and you could have wars. And the losing side in most wars, as we know, the victorious side would often take captives, and these captives are made to work. And I always make the distinction to my students that is a vast distinction between commercial enslavement as opposed to people that were captured after a conflict, that yes, they would be put to work, they could engage in agriculture, but in these cases, they could actually integrate and become part of the society in which they had been captured. So there are many instances where people that had been captured in conflicts between African societies emerged to become leaders within those same societies. They married within those societies, became owners of property, became owners of land within those societies. This is a vast distinction between the enslavement of chattel slavery, where Africans were actually captured and shipped to the so-called New World to engage in labor exclusively from sunrise to sunset for all of their lives, and their descendants would continue in that type of activity. That is chattel slavery, as opposed to the kind of captivity, forced labor from captivity that people engage in Africa. But then I want to distinguish this with the kind of dealing in enslaved Africans that also emerged between the North Africa and the southern part of Africa, where also you did have the development of the type of commercial enslavement that evolved in that part of the world.
Milton, before Africans were the primary source of slaves, of people who were turned into slaves, the Europeans up until that time had been the predominant people who were enslaved. all the way from the Roman time, because if you look at a lot of
Yes.
yeah, they would say that mankind has always had enslavement, but that's not true, because early African cultures were more of a communal type of culture, of civilization, where everybody more or less tried to provide a situation where everybody was taken care of. And this, I would say, capitalist sense of enslavement comes about at a later time. But if you
Yes.
could speak, and we'll take up, the next part of this in our next uh, adventure. But Europeans, after the conquest of Egypt by Greece and then Rome, uh, Rome began a very intense slavement of people. And when I say intense, they were different from the African uh, enslavement of human beings, and that continued and got even more sophisticated. But during that time, it was primarily um, Europeans, which led to the development of their Slavs being enslaved, so forth. But primary
Correct.
Europeans were the people who were enslaved for hundreds of years before
Correct.
Africans were enslaved. In fact, Africans were still primary leading and developing the European world at that time. Can you kind of speak on that, and we'll close out on that, and we'll take it up and continue in terms of part two.
Well, you've actually covered a good aspect of that history already in terms of the historical stages of the institution of enslavement. And of course, as you and I know, that part of the history is not widely taught anymore because it's almost like almost an unsaid agreement that is much more convenient to portray Africans as the only people that had been enslaved historically. And you and I know why that is the reason. That is the reason to continue conditioning people's mindset in our 21st century to be receptive and accommodating to the continued exploitation of Africa and the marginalization of Africans in diaspora, whether African descendants here in the United States or in Brazil, where Africans are the majority population, but people would not even know that because of the media representation. So there's a historical reason and a contemporary reason to maintain that narrative that wipes out all that history of enslavement that you just enumerated and just focus on the period of the enslavement of Africans, and to additionally also wipe out all the history that we just discussed today, so that many of our young students don't know that Africa had an history beyond enslavement, so that you have a generation of young descendants of Africa who believe that the history of Africa begins with Africans being enslaved by Europeans, and to wipe out the fact that, in fact, before Europe existed as nation states, Africa had already thrived. Many kingdoms, the kind of societies and civilizations that we discussed today, including Egypt, including Mali, including Ghana, including Songhai, including Zimbabwe, including Congo, and all the many other civilizations that flourish in Africa. And that was the reason to break up the history and present only the partial history, which only has Africans being the victims of enslavement.
So, Milton, if you would kind of summarize that scramble for Africa, because we're going to talk about the new scramble for Africa, the resources, what's going on right now, because Africa went through a period of colonization
Right.
after it fought for independence and partially gained independence. Ethiopia is the only African country that was never totally enslaved or colonized.
Correct.
So that when we look at back then, the scramble for Africa resulted in the industrialization of Europe and America. And it was the Africans that were brought from Africa to America that both physically and mentally pretty
Correct.
much built America,
Absolutely.
made America what it is. Even if you look at its morality and its principles and mathematics as the basis of engineering and all of the other intellectual accomplishments that enable Europe to be what it is. Those are all African creations and African contributions to Western culture. But Europeans will only begin to deal with Western culture from the standpoint that they claim it's Greek culture. And so nothing is really ever taught about Africa. So, in your summary, can you give us kind of a summary of that first scramble for Africa in which you've been talking about for the gold and the resources, especially salt and all of the spices and things that Europeans did not have, but found in Africa and brought here?
Okay, I like this because in our conversation, you contribute, and I appreciate that because, in fact, in posing your question, you've actually summarized most of that early engagement, and I just want to add into what you just said in terms of the early Africans and their contribution. Many people forget that the Africans who were enslaved and brought into the New World were the most sophisticated from their communities. These were highly skilled farmers, for example, in many cases, so that when they came to the New World, to the United States, or when they went to Brazil, for example, they engaged in high-level agriculture. They were able to produce surplus very quickly because they knew the technique. Farming is not just scattering seeds on an open field. You have to know the technique. You have to know the quality of the soil. You have to know how to rotate the crops. You have to know how to preserve the soil. So the Africans that had been brought, some of them had already been engaging in terrace farming along the ridges of mountains in Africa. So they knew sophisticated levels of agriculture. And that is why they were super beneficial to the countries where they were robbed and taken to. And on the converse side, the impact was negative. In fact, Africa was depopulated of the most skilled type of labor, the most skilled craftsmen. Some of these people actually were people that belonged in guilds that specialized in ironsmith, in goldsmith. They had their own closed societies, and these were also captured and taken into enslavement. So you can imagine the negative impact on the African continent. And then through the whole institution of enslavement, a war, a very genocidal war, was actually now promoted in Africa because now there's incentive to actually plunder your neighbor and to help have them being captured and taken into the New World. So there was a period of time for perhaps more than a century where Africa was the only region of the world where the population did not grow, where the population actually declined. And you can see the historical analysis. After the era of the enslavement regime was over, then, not surprisingly, the population of Africa started growing once again at a greater rate than other parts of the world, such as Europe, for example. So I just wanted to add that to the point that you already presented. And that, I think that sets us up and takes us to the formal colonization of Africa in the latter stage of the 19th century with the Berlin Conference of 1884-85.
Milton, I want to thank you. Again, it's great to participate in this lecture with you. I look forward to our next session. I really do, because
I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful, brother.
People really need. So again, I want to thank you, and I want people to go to and join us. I mean, you know, click the like button. Do all those. Even give us a cash app, whatever. Help us to grow and keep going. We have about 500 tapes that we've put up. We have about 20,000 hours that we're trying to digitize and get to you, including some of those trips that we made to Africa.
Oh, excellent, excellent.
We've been there with everybody, Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark. I mean, we want to put them all up. You name the people, the historians, and we've traveled with them. So hit the Cash App. Darrell, is the Cash App up there so people can donate and help us out a little bit? You know, again, Milton, thank you so much.
No, thank you. Knowledge is power, brother. We need to really empower our younger generation with the knowledge and the power so that they can actually carry us to the next level of the liberation struggle.
I want to thank you.
Thank you, brother.
All right now.